Kia ora koutou katoa, tihei mauri ora, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello semuanya, hola a todos. Hey, good evening everybody. Hope you're all healthy and well and happy. And yeah, I'm gonna do another live talking about a topic that was brought, uh, it's not right to say brought to my attention. I saw a post by brother Nate Taiapa, and he posted something about Maori and our, attitudes and maybe our connection with liquor back in the old colonial times, and it just led me to think about it. It's something I've been thinking about on and off for several years actually. But anyway, the topic of my live this evening is the Kiwi drinking culture and how very much it's embedded into our lives. Um, I'm not, this live is not to preach to anybody about what they should or shouldn't do. You have absolute freedom to do what's within your legal right to do. So I'm not interested in judging people about drinking or getting people to stop drinking or anything like that. I'm just interested in drinking as a cultural norm, I would say, in our country. And not only in our country, drinking alcohol is a cultural norm in many places. And for some cultures, it's a very old practice, I'll call it. Um, yeah, I've had interesting experiences of alcohol throughout my life, and by experiences, I'm not just talking about getting on the piss, which that's part of life, but growing up around it, observing it as a young child, and as a teen, as an adolescent, growing into a young adult, and then into adulthood, and having experiences with it, but also observing it around me, and then in later years reflecting on that and what it means. So by calling the the, the drinking in New Zealand a culture, yeah, I mean that very deliberately and very deeply, you might say. It's embedded into our culture. So, uh, if you're joining me for this live and you have some comments about it or some views of your own, like I say, I repeat, I'm not taking a side and trying to tell people they shouldn't do anything. I'm actually, to be honest, I'm quite interested in a range of views because I'm not simply looking for people to agree with me. If you are someone who enjoys a drink, whether it's moderately or even, more than moderately, that's fine. And if you have an opinion that you want to share and or a question that you have or you disagree with me, that's cool because a range of views would be even better. But basically, other than that, I'm here to share my opinions, views, and some experiences that led to those views and opinions about alcohol. And I want to also touch on or reflect upon being Maori, and alcohol, the relationship with Maori and alcohol. When I say touch on, that's literally all I mean. I'm not an expert in with all the stats and all of that around it, but just my feelings about it. And particularly, I'd like to reflect on the stance that my great grandfather took towards alcohol. He died 10 years before I was born, so I don't have any first-hand experience, but there's lots of legends and stories and family sort of tales have come down about his view on alcohol. And my grandfather, who's his son, I'm talking about my grandfather and great grandfather, he shared things with me that I'll never forget. Um, so yeah, if anybody's joining me for this live and you have an opinion in and around alcohol and its consumption, use, and role in our society, especially here in New Zealand, please do join and drop a comment, even just let me know you're here. Yeah, I made some notes. This is a new thing for me, by the way, doing lives like for this in this style. I've up until last Sunday when I did my first one, something like this, I'd only ever like sung a song once live on Facebook and done some DJ stuff. But as far as like talking about topics, it's pretty new to me, so I'm still getting used to it. So bear with me is my point. Yeah, so alcohol in New Zealand, I'll go to my notes and just sort of I might jump here and there and everywhere. I don't have a spiel, but I do have some notes because there's certain things I'd like to touch on. So, a little bit about me for those who don't know me. I'll just zoom through this. I was born in '75, so I'm 44 years old now. Um, I grew up around, like most pretty much all Kiwi kids, like a certain amount of alcohol was just around with adults and young adults and older adults in my life. I do have experiences in my upbringing of excessive alcohol and the problems fall out from that with the adults in my life. I don't want to incriminate anybody, so I won't go into who, what, where, when, why, or anything. But yeah, I grew up around alcohol. Um, Sometimes moderate, sometimes excessive, and that was just, especially if you're a kid from those days, born in the '70s, grown up in the '80s. I think it's safe to say that the attitudes towards liquor, especially maybe not the attitudes actually, but the laws around liquor have certainly tightened up in recent years. But they didn't seem to be so tight back then. Yeah, that was so normal Kiwi kid growing up around booze. Let's put it that way. Um, I think it's pretty common knowledge that alcohol was introduced into New Zealand back in colonial times. The British brought alcohol with them. You had the sealers, the traders, the colonialists, the settlers. They brought an alcohol culture with them from Europe, and Britain in particular back in those days. So Maori people, our people, were not accustomed to it. We didn't. We're famous. Well, famous. We're famous in New Zealand. World famous in New Zealand for not having any intoxicants really of any sort in our culture and daily practices. So we weren't, using drugs or alcohol of any sort. So it was this brand new thing. And Maori called it waipiro, which for language nerds like myself and to Reo Maori in particular, wai is water or liquid, and piro is something that is putrid or stinking or rotten. So they named this drink that the British brought with them waipiro, stinking water. And I think that's an apt name. But anyway, it goes to show how foreign it was to them. Like what is this stinking water? So anyway, the liquor drinking has been in our country since those colonial times, and slowly but surely over generations become entrenched in our culture. Um, my friend Dougie down in Dunedin, kia ora Dougie, kānui te mihi kia koe. He dropped a comment today which reminded me. It didn't inform me, but it certainly reminded me in a very timely fashion that liquor was also a part of the colonization process. Um, it was used in a way at times, very cynically, very manipulatively, to get our people drunk, especially people of influence, be they leaders, rangatira chiefs, and if they could be, you know, made drunk or whatever, they could, they'd do deals or over things, or yeah, there's all sorts of shady things going on in and around alcohol that were not just about partying and having a good time. There was also political motives going on with the use of alcohol, and that was, that's a dreadful thing to realize, but it's the truth. Um, I'm assuming this, and correct me if I'm wrong, the British brought with them not only the liquor itself, but the culture, the sort of what became something we connect drinking booze with sort of that pioneer, hard man, tough guy. There's a lot of staunch and manhood attached to drinking. Um, and I suspect that began in the colonial times, and maybe even pre-colonial, like back in Britain, and it's sort of embedded itself deeply into our culture. It's still there. We still associate drinking liquor with manhood. You can see that in so many different areas of our community and society. Um, like even breweries sponsoring big events, like especially around rugby, and like rugby is another manhood type aggressive man's game. So drinking beer and playing rugby and being a hard man, those are the things that are sort of up on the surface and big iconic symbols of New Zealand. But in a more grassroots level, you've got drinking yard glasses and holding your piss. For those who aren't from New Zealand or Australia, piss is a don't take it literally. Piss is a slang term for alcohol here in New Zealand and Australia. So, hold your purse, and, you've got all of these tough rites of passage type behaviors that go with alcohol, and that's all been around for generation upon generation. We've all learned that growing up and observed it. Back in the days, you had I think it was called the 6 o'clock swill. Someone older might be able to correct me if I've said that wrong. The 6 o'clock swill. So what happened was, for those, and this is before my time, so I didn't witness this, but in my grandparents' generation, and maybe my dad's youth, pubs closed at 6 p.m. So what would and most working men and women um, finished work at 5 p.m. So they would rush to the pubs and just binge drink as much as they could because they had 1 hour before the pubs closed. So that binge drinking culture was kind of the norm. My dad, I don't think my dad will not feel bad about me sharing this, that he was saying, his dad was famous for the 6 o'clock swill, and every Friday evening he would come home, rotten drunk from the pub, and they used to not only drink as much as they could between 5 and 6, but they would buy bottles to take home, and if they, I think it was illegal actually. I don't know if they were supposed to be doing that, but yeah, my dad said that was a sort of a part of his upbringing, the normal part, and I'm sure for that generation that was the case. So this tough guy, binge drinking, hold your piss, a man, play rugby, drink beer, all of that stuff has been built upon layer of generations in New Zealand for as long as colonial times at the very least. Um, now I want to backtrack because I want to share sort of family story of sorts around my great grandfather Tuhohi o Rekenepehi. He died in 65, like 10 years before I was born. But what's important, and I really find inspiration in this to an extent, is that he was vehemently, passionately anti-alcohol. And he raised 16 children, which was not even a particularly big family in those days. Maori families were always big. And in those days, 16 kids was pretty normal. So he raised 16 children back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Um, and he was absolutely against alcohol. He forbid it on his property. Apparently, he'd go, you didn't dare flout the rules around that because he was a big man, he was a strong man, and he was very, very fiercely anti-alcohol. And most of the people in my family know this because it's sort of like a family story or handed down or whatever. But my grandfather, he shared with me a few years ago, and may he rest in peace now. But my grandfather and I were chatting a few years ago, and he told me that the source of his father's anti-alcohol stance was he was seeing back then what it was, the damage it was doing in the community. He saw that drunkenness and booze was damaging the people, the families, and the community even back then. And we're talking 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, kind of way back. He saw the writing on the wall with alcohol, and he didn't want any part of it. So that was a big part of his reasoning. But the other part was health, just simply health. Like apparently he himself came from a family where several of his siblings died in their childhoods from TB. Um, so he was one of the survivors, and he just had it in his mind. However, I'm not sure, he had it in his mind that, don't drink, don't smoke, be as healthy as you can. He even told my grandfather and no doubt his siblings, if you guys get sick, I can't afford to send you to doctors and hospitals and medicines and all that, which back in those days in the Depression years was a luxury. There was not the public health service we have now. He goes, so he instilled in his children that they ought to be strong and fit and healthy as possible, not only to be fit and strong for the sake of it and be healthy, but to avoid, sickness and ultimately death if you can. So it might have been a very simple way of looking at things, and it wasn't sophisticated in the sense of knowing all about biology and medicine and all that. But his thing was don't drink, don't smoke, be healthy, work. You play sports. Like my family is big in boxing and rugby. In those days, he was a wood chopper himself and a champion wood chopper, like well known, famous for it. So yeah, physical activity and being physically healthy were a big part of my great grandfather's legacy with his family. And my grandfather, one of 16, he carried that on in his life. Now, that was, I'm just talking about cigarettes and alcohol. I'm not talking about vices, what other vices, but there wasn't the illicit drugs, of course, back then. So pretty clean living, physically at least. Um, yeah, my so that's a legacy that I really look up to and feel inspired by, because yeah, I've taken that route myself in later years in my own life, and I find inspiration in that. And I see the same damage. I see 50, 60, 70 years later, after my great grandfather was saying it, I see the same damage. I see the damage that alcohol does in our community. I've certainly not seen anything good alcohol does. At the very best, alcohol doesn't cause harm to everybody. That's the best it gets, you know, and then it spirals downwards from there for many people. The facts, the numbers just don't lie about that. Um, so I'm jumping around again a wee bit, but I grew up like a regular teen adolescent. I aspired to drink when I could. I started drinking illegally, as most of us did, at 14, 15. I can't remember exactly. Sneakily, and then older siblings or people would give it to you, and you'd do it under the undercover. And then when we were old enough to be more socially accepted, then we drank openly, and we enjoyed it, and we had fun, and we partied, and we just did what all young people did then and do now as far as the drinking goes. Quite oblivious to all the stuff I'm talking about. You don't realize it's a part of your culture. You just don't see the forest for the trees. It's normal.